You are live.
Very cool. Very cool indeed.
It's good to be live. It's better to be alive.
Most definitely. Most definitely.
Mm,
Although, hopefully, the two are interconnected in some regard.
yes. So, Tom, you and I have been speaking for over an hour at this point, but from the YouTube perspective, we're just getting started.
Certainly.
You asked me a pretty challenging question at the start of your portion of this conversation, which was KMO, account for yourself. So, right
You
back
want me
at
to
you.
account for myself? Okay. I'm a carbon life form here, performing in front of you. Some may say a noble ape. So, for the past 28 years, I have maintained an open source simulation called a variety of different things. It was originally called the Nevada Project. Then, for the longest time, it was called Noble Ape. Now it's called the Ape SDK. And the idea was to create a rich biological and philosophical simulation, which at the time when I was at university just didn't exist. The whole nature of I 1996, there was a book published called The Philosophy of Artificial Life by Margaret A. Bowden. And that book really seeded me with the idea that I could create these amazing simulation environments. Now, ironically, a few years, maybe 3 years after that, I discovered a way to actually get blitting on a Apple computer, a Mac, faster than Apple could do it through my simulation work. So there's a whole series of kind of tangential technologies that have come off from my simulation work. Anyway, Apple invited me there. I got to meet Steve Jobs briefly. It was quite fascinating in '98, I think. And then this eventually, through a fellow called Douglas Rushkoff, a media theorist, got me back in the US. Okay, maybe he's not a media theorist anymore, but we could delve into that if you see fit. But that is basically how, and you and I met through potentially a fellow called Lorenzo Haggerty, by which time I had been in the US for probably about 15 years, I think. So when people ask me where I'm from, I always say Las Vegas. That's just an easy way to say, before anyone asks me, aren't you British? Aren't you South African? Is always a favorite of mine. Aren't you New Zealander? They never get to New Zealand. They're always in South Africa or England or Australia. People with particularly good ears would say that I was from Australia, which is technically true, although I hold both British and Australian citizenship. Ironically, my children can't hold either British or Australian citizenship because they're born in the US, and the way they were born affects them from not getting Australian citizenship. So my father
How
wrote on.
many ways are there to be born?
I would say at least three currently.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, how about natural, like vaginal delivery? Does that
Well,
affect your
clearly you've
citizenship?
described one version of being born.
Yeah.
There are other ways to be born. It depends, without putting too fine a point on it, it depends on who owns the vagina, basically.
Gotcha.
And if you take that into consideration, that's the problem with regards to Australia,
I
is that
see.
they have a particular proclivity with regards to, although my daughters have, we have the birth certificate, which says that my wife is the mother.
Hmm.
And really, technically, we probably get Australian citizenship if we wanted to flag it through. We can't get British citizenship. That's absolutely impossible because I wasn't born in England. My father was born in England, which means I am um, British by descent, not by natural means. So that eliminates the citizenship there. But in the process of having these daughters who have their own citizenship and US citizenship, I'm kind of begging the question of why I don't convert over. The first thing is I'm useless at remembering esoteric facts associated with history, which seems to be a large requirement for the US citizenship process. But also, there's a requirement that you are called to battle before US citizens. So if they have which could be coming in the future, if they have conscription of any form, I by going through the naturalization process, enable myself to be conscripted first, so to speak. So there are all these kind of eclectic histories that you need to get into, but yet becoming American to be conscripted first. I had a long-time friend who was actually a prisoner of war in Cambodia and then Vietnam, and his interaction with me kind of changed my whole hypothesis of what the US was as a kind of state. So it'll be unlikely that I found my old green card for a period of time. Um, I'll probably continue to be a green card, allowed to live in the US under their own existence for, I don't know, to the end of my life. if I'm not able to continue to maintain myself in the future, be it through dementia or half a dozen other things, I might consider becoming a US citizen at that time. But as it is currently, I just enjoy not being a US citizen for above reasons. So I guess that kind of answers your question associated with what kinds of vaginas there are.
Yes, I derailed you there. So go back to before I interrupted. You're talking about your history as an A-life pioneer.
Well, it is interesting because I've had the opportunity of knowing a lot of people in the iLove community very well. Literally today, I'm interviewing a fellow called Steve Grand, who I've known for 25 years now. He lives in Arizona. I live in Las Vegas. Our paths have never crossed. We really need to agree to meet at some stage because every year we have a conversation. This year we're having a video conversation, which we haven't had historically. It's going to be quite interesting as I look at your face. I think there's KMO. I will be having a video conversation with Steve Grand, and I'll be able to look in his face and say, "This is Steve Grand." Steve Grand ran the Biota 2 conference, which Bruce Damer obviously made into the Biota series, which I then made into the Biota podcast. But he's a fascinating character because his fans think of him as a capital S scientist, and I've always thought of myself as a capital H hobbyist. And my view is that Steve Grand is very much a capital H hobbyist. However, he has an OBE from the now king. So, I mean, he has all these, he's British by birth, by naturalization. And he received an OBE from Prince Charles because Prince Charles, they were in a meeting at the London Eye, and Prince Charles said, "Have we ever done anything for you?" Which apparently is the way you get OBEs when you know Charles. I have an
So
uncle who knows
for
Charles very
Americans,
well.
what is an OBE?
It's the Order of the British Empire,
Mhm.
which means, ironically, he's I wouldn't say a fanatical atheist, but he's certainly friends with Richard Dawkins. And I always tease him that he has this Order of the British Empire, which means he needs to comply with the British Church requirements, or the Anglican, or what's called here, I think, Episcopalian Church requirements, which, you know, the fact that he knew Richard Dawkins for a period of time, and they occasionally, when Richard Dawkins goes to Arizona, go out for a beer together. It's not jealousy; it's just a curious series of incidents that I've kind of continued. But yeah, literally, probably 3 dozen people, I would think, are part of this artificial life community. Ironically, we were talking about ChatGPT. I interviewed a fellow called Professor Ken Stanley, who used to work for OpenAI, famously no longer works for OpenAI. But in this podcast feed, in Last Monkey Standing, I'm not sure where this podcast is going. He talks very intimately about how COVID impacted OpenAI, which I think is absolutely fascinating. That if you look at the rise of OpenAI and the rise of COVID and the fall of COVID, OpenAI was able to run what he calls $10 million runs, which are ultimately computer processing fundamentally, but just have the ability to run their large language models through this, what he calls $10 million runs. I thought was absolutely fascinating. And the artificial life community historically, I think, has had a number of other $10 million runs, but they just haven't been at an instance of $10 million runs. They've been, as my life has been, working for some anonymous streaming company, having gone into Apple, having had Apple and Intel use my simulation. It's just very curious, this notion of what is now paradigm is the $10 million run, but the fact that the A-Life community has had that just in individuals and universities and this kind of stuff. Ken Stanley was very not forceful. He just seemed to think he was provocatively disagreeing with the fact that there were $10 million runs that had existed in A-Life. Anyway, I'm rambling.
Well, a $10 million training run for a large language model in 2024 would be trivial. They are much more expensive to train now. And
Certainly.
that's because of a discovery that people in artificial intelligence made, was that you don't really have to understand a mind to make one. You just have to throw volume at it. You don't have to understand how to get a computer to understand concepts. You just create bigger and bigger neural nets and get more and more data, and force them through the neural nets to create pathways and weights. And the more money and compute you throw at it, the smarter the product that comes out at the end, which is, what do they call it? The dismal realization or something like that. I mean, it's very disheartening. It's basically an admission that, yeah, we don't know what consciousness is. We don't really know how brains work. We don't know what thinking is. But the more money and compute that we throw at this process, the better the output. So we're just going to keep scaling up, and we're going to do, $1 trillion training runs in the near future.
The point I would make to that is that the insight that Ken Stanley brought from biology was associated with symmetry. And if you have neural symmetry where the neural networks are, rather than just a blob of neural networks, where you have symmetry in the neural networks, you can actually get more compute for your money, which I think is the genius basically that he brought. Here I'm talking about simulations called Neuro, Neuro, and NEAT, NEAT, which both origins that Kevin Stanley went with. Part of being a historian in this community, let's just call me that, is that you understand that there have been certain breakthroughs that have been made by certain people which haven't historically been talked about. But Ken Stanley's big work was the symmetry of neural networks. I have a friend called Larry Yeager who did this at Google for a small period of time. He had a simulation called Polyworld for a number of years, which people looking at a kind of abstract way might say my Noble Ape was like Polyworld. They're actually distinctly different. My ways of simulating the mind are in layered form rather than in a single view of the mind. And I think in a layered form of the mind, you actually get a lot of nuance, which you don't typically get from neural networks. However, Ken Stanley obviously was a pioneer in this field, and in bringing symmetry to OpenAI, you could get much more, well, bang for the buck, basically, associated with the money that they were putting into these large runs.
So a lot of the people who started OpenAI have either outright like rage quit or left to start their own companies, or I think in the case of Greg Brockman, just sort of stepped back and said, "Yeah, I'm still part of the company, but I'm not really going to work here anymore. I'm taking an open-ended sabbatical."
They
And
become emeritus fundamentally.
yeah, but it seems that the people who were originally like the core group of people who had a vision for this thing have decided that AI or OpenAI, the company, is not the place to pursue that vision. And in the cases of people like Dario Amodei, who went off to start Anthropic, which is the company that makes Claude, just openly said, "Look, what you're doing here, Sam Altman, is not safe. So I'm going to go off and do what we said we were going to do, you know, over at Anthropic." I wonder, what your insight is into that mentality and the conflict, over safety in that community.
Well, there are two paths I would go down. Let me create kind of dot points that I could trace back in what I'm taking. The nature of being creative and what this generative AI could do with regards to creativity is one path. I think there's a history of people, as you say, that just become incredibly concerned with what they've created. And it's interesting because I've certainly felt that in my technical experience maybe two or three times. The fellow I knew at Apple who invited me there first was a fellow called George Warner. And sorry, I, as you are, reading the chat at the same time. He basically wrote missile systems that were used in the first Gulf War and realized he didn't want to be in that game anymore. So the notion of ethics and technology, I think, is always evolving. I have a strong sense that you can pay people to remove the ethics in most occasions. I mean, this is fundamentally the Nazis as well. So, there have been times in history where people have been paid in order to leave their ideals behind. And that's what I think is increasingly interesting in the tech industry, is that the kind of human objections are very rarely there. Returning to my dots associated with, let's go in a different direction. I think I've probably said enough with regards
Okay,
to that.
fair enough. Well, I'm very focused on AI simply because it's something that I was interested in the abstract in the 90s, back when, there was this, like my graduate study was in the philosophy of mind, and I was
Mhm.
focused on artificial intelligence. And at the time, this notion of creating neural networks that could equal, if not exceed, the performance of just good old-fashioned symbolic programming was speculative. This is in the 90s. This is almost not 20 years, but 15 years before Jeffrey Hinton and his team, in 2012. And um, it was just, it was not even science fiction because it was too abstract to really even hang a story on, you know, to be, it just wasn't in the public consciousness. And now that approach is AI to a lot of people. A lot of people just use AI and large language model interchangeably,
Mm,
and it's touching so many different people's lives all over the place, and it seems really powerful. And yet, at the same time, the amount of investment capital going into the sector is not producing the sorts of returns that you would expect. People
exactly.
are having a very difficult time monetizing this thing and figuring out, how to make it economically worth the investment that's been put into it. So let me stop there and have you comment on that aspect of it.
I actually remembered my dot points, but I'll return to this. I think the way artists are seeing this tends to be going in two routes. They see what can I use this thing to be creative with, and then they're against what is actually produced through it. The nature of this kind of technology is that it doesn't provide profit instantaneously unless you can link creative people with the technology and produce a kind of gestalt that is greater than the sum of the parts. And that's what I think is absolutely fascinating. That what is coming out of this is firstly a chance for people to lose a lot of money in investment, but also is driving Nvidia, is driving these companies that have an AI story now associated with them. They're big tech, but they have an AI story associated with them. Um, I remember there's some meme associated with um, how do you make a tech company more money? You just basically say it's AI at its core. Um, what's interesting with the dates that you mentioned of AI, my work predates that fundamentally. It's wonderful having papers that came out in 2013 saying that is what I viewed intelligence as being in 2013. Why have some of these ideas obviously flourished? Some of these ideas have failed, but the academic part of this has not actually been undertaken properly. I think what fascinates me is that uh, really OpenAI has any evaluation currently. I mean, I think it's technology which is not like Facebook was, it's not like Apple was, it's its own thing. And the notion of financially evaluating it currently and all the spin offs that come from it all seem to be in, let's say, a 1990s paradigm. It doesn't exist in 1990s paradigm. The thing that interests me is the ability for people to cobble together what they can and make repersonalize, for want of better terminology, which you seem to be discussing with regards to Claude. Now we just need to make that open source, and then you have the perfect lazing of multiple, um, ideas. I always return to the fact that when I last lived in Las Vegas, we would occasionally, my colleagues and I would occasionally drive by Home Depots, and one of my friends said, "Why don't we just invite those guys in and they can have our Friday meeting for us?" This notion of utility in order to deal with certain circumstances is not new at all. But the way in which it's being focused with the contemporary, the chat GPT class, for want of a better term, makes it seem more like we've got to be getting utility out of this thing now. We've got to be getting money out of this thing now. And I don't think for a majority of these kind of technologies, literally, I was talking with a fellow called, well, he's known as Adam Starcaster, but his original name is Adam McLeod, who will be on this, well, not this video recording, but the Last Monkey Standing video recording. Anyway, he basically is putting his time and energy into an AI startup where it's not actually utilizing any money. And as someone who's incredibly intelligent, who's literally worked on many, many high profile titles. Okay. The chat does sometimes spit out more interesting things than anyway. So it is fascinating seeing who will work for nothing, basically.
Have you seen the movie Small Soldiers?
No, it's my hobby is collecting interest. It's not
Uh,
seeing movies. I rarely actually watch movies anymore.
well, it's not recent. It's at least 10 years old, if not more. But there's basically a toy company, and there's a company that's doing AI military research and a toy company, and they get a new CEO who's just really, we need profits now, and we need a new product that's really sexy and exciting. And like, there's a commercial for this GI Joe type figure who punches through the plastic window in his packaging,
Yes.
and the CEO says, "I want it to do that for real. Not in a commercial. I want it to be real." And so, the the toy company basically takes the military AI they've been creating and they put it into these toy soldiers, and the toy soldiers have their enemies who are monstrous creatures, and they both get the AI. And basically, a war erupts between the toy soldiers and the monsters, but the monsters are the good guys. The toy soldiers are, they are soldiers in the worst, the way that the left hates America, their view of the military, that's what's in this movie. So the GI Joe action figures that can move and think and coordinate their actions are the bad guys. But it's at least the first scene, the boardroom scene of the film, is so worth watching. Ben Rubber, who plays that CEO? Um, Might be Dennis Leary, I think. But it's just that boardroom scene by itself is a self-contained like gem. It's worth finding on YouTube.
Interesting. Interesting. Yes, the Stanley Kubrick film AI,
Mm-hmm. Yep, Dennis Leary.
associated with Deslear, yeah, okay. Um, I found that absolutely fascinating because it was again a vein of my life. I was interested in 2000. Was it? Yeah, it was 2000 when I worked with the uh, what was called the Internet Pocket Toy, which was a new generation of Tamagotchis. I was working on that for Bandai as a startup, basically. What interests me is the teddy bear in AI, because I
Mm-hmm.
think that that nature of plush robotics that are actively, talking and interacting is something that's not been done properly. It's done through tricks and these kind of things. At the same time, I was writing artificial life on microcontrollers, and I thought, okay, I could create an artificial life teddy bear that would go and interact. Here's the funny part of the story. For the first probably 10 years I did my simulation work, one of the largest downloaders was the Iranian military. The Iranian military downloaded it for, large chunks of time. We're literally 300,000 active hits of traffic where they were downloading stuff, reading documentation, this kind of stuff. The rise of AI in what would be the terminology that one would use for the Iranian military? I don't know. The rise of just this thing, and the thought was, okay, they're going to make this into Terminator like robots. My last experience in this world will be being shot by one of these robots that were generated against my technology. Like, irony is very big in the universe, and I've got to watch out for this thing. Ultimately, my daughters are potentially also likely to dispose of me in some circumstance. But no, the Iranian military was very curious for me because I thought, whatever became of this thing? Well, actually, ironically, I have a friend who's interviewing with the Saudi military for using these kind of technologies. So the notion that the military will be the forcing function for these kind of things, I think, is absolutely fascinating and certainly lends itself to my own experience. I've never ever talked to anyone in the US military about this phenomena. It strikes me as strange that the US in cyber attacks and all these kind of things that they never actually return to the why on earth are these countries actually trying to get our AI and study our AI for that. But yes, if ever there was an STK film, I would think that the Iranian military, or at least some foreign military organization that is, channeling these kind of things. I don't know whatever happened to those researchers. I wish they'd reached out to me or someone from a university or something like that, because it was just sheer volume of downloads, which was actually quite intimate with regards to the stuff that they were accessing. Um, anyway,
Well, one of the big AI safety concerns is that military applications where nuclear weapons require enormous industrial capacity and access to very rare elements, AI does not. And we're seeing like a rapid evolution in drone warfare in Ukraine with these first-person perspective drones. So you've got a pilot somewhere who's basically playing a video game trying to kill people in real time, and many times succeeding. Um, and it seems like the era of the human piloted drone will be fairly short lived, because I'm thinking pretty soon just an autonomous drone will be able to outperform them and be cheaper.
Certainly,
Yeah, and more
certainly,
and scalable. You know,
yes.
you have to have at least the guys with the video game controllers. They are, a limited resource. That's a choke point in your military supply line, where you can just crank out as many autonomous drones, or they don't even need to be autonomous themselves. They can be just one controlling AI back at the bunker, controlling 100 of them instead of 100 guys with game controllers. But
Friendly
yeah,
fire is ultimately the danger in those circumstances. I mean, I think that will get human control for these kind of technologies. They're actually based in Las Vegas for what they did in Iraq and Afghanistan. So physical proximity is not that, but I think the nature of friendly fire, which when the US regained its foothold in Afghanistan, they still had Stinger missiles that they haven't been able to deactivate. So this notion of military technology being a double-edged sword with regards to being, friendly fire, one technology that may not evolve dramatically, but still poses a risk to humans that are entering into this conflict zone, I think it's kind of played itself out. The propensity for people to just stomach this as being a way where it's acceptable in modern warfare, I think is also fascinating, because it's indicative of a militarization, which I think has happened in the past 20 years. I mean, certainly while I've lived in the US, and an acceptance basically that the military is a greater force that has no moral. We have no, very similar to your AI analogy, we have no moral authority with regards to the military in these circumstances. They just continue to do what they do in a particular fashion. So yes, I'm very concerned about AI in this context. If you can see the US military, its adaptations with it, but I think we'll still probably have to have fundamentally human control in order to avoid friendly fire. That's my hope anyway.
when I think of the U.S. military's use of UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles, and you've got your pilot in a container in Las Vegas controlling something, a multi-million-dollar device that has a whole support team, to get it into the air. That's a very different thing from, say, a Mexican drug cartel putting hand grenades or other explosives on a $200 consumer grade drone and using that to attack police or attack their rivals, in other cartels. I don't really, I think going forward, the US military and other big players, big funded players who have a lot of accountability in terms of who they have to answer to for their actions, they're not going to be the real innovators. I think the small players who have either ethnic hatred as their motivating factor or just brutal mercenary, commercial interests like the drug cartels are going to be the ones who are going to be driving the innovative. And I hate to, soil the term innovative with this example, but they will be the innovators.
Do you have any background in radio controlled planes or anything like that?
I like to watch people play with them, but I've never invested money in them.
So the cost associated with radio controlled planes was in the motors and the servos.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the servos move the flaps, for example, for the benefit of the people that are watching this in live stream. The cost associated with the components that make radio controlled planes, be it the motors, be it the servos, have all become pennies, literally 2 or 3 cents on the dollar of what they used to cost. And I think what's fascinating is, in particular in this country, a hobbyist community could grow up very rapidly. It used to be the case that you had about $1,000 in a radio controlled plane. It's now the case that you have maybe $80 if you're lucky in a radio controlled plane. And that forcing function has come through what I would call the hobbyist community, fundamentally. The parts associated with radio controlled planes and the parts associated with drones and this kind of stuff have become incredibly cheap. I agree with you. I think the adversaries here will just continue to utilize these technologies as they continue to be driven down in price. It always struck me as strange that the notion of the suicide bomber still existed 10, 15 years ago. People are still wanting to use their bodies in these circumstances. But ultimately, as you say, a grenade contained in a drone, can do probably infinitely more damage than historically would have been the case. The bow and arrow is the old analogy. When humans started using bow and arrows, they didn't have to face the death that they were causing. And that metaphor, I think, has continued on to modern day warfare. That basically is being optimized for things based on hobbyists, as our chat.
Yes, this is Ben Rubber in the chat who says, "My brother has gas radio controlled cars and helicopters. Smells so nostalgic, but gas is rare now." Yeah, yeah. I saw somebody flying a radio controlled plane just at the soccer field, which is just a couple minutes walk from here, a few weeks ago. And what struck me was that it, as far as I know, didn't have cameras. He didn't have a cell phone strapped to his radio controller. He's just looking at it and visualizing what his view would be from the front
Certainly.
of the plane. Whereas with a quadcopter drone, it can just stay level on its own. The newer ones, anyway, you don't have to constantly, be fiddling with your thumbs to keep it level. And even more so, you can call up an overhead map of the area and just tap the screen and say, "Go here." And it like the level of skill required to interact with the thing and direct it is dramatically lower with the new quadcopter drones than it was with radio controlled, airplanes or helicopters
Certainly,
or
but the
things like that.
components, be engines or servos or what have you, have become incredibly cheap. I mean, I remember
Yeah.
when I was here in 1991, the first experience I had in the US, going to Ralph Waldo Emerson Junior High School because my father couldn't look after me. So going to summer school basically here. I bought a radio controller for about $100, which had two servos in it. It was a two-channel radio controller. Took it back to Australia, installed it in a car, which I manufactured myself, basically out of parts. Um, the cost now associated with servos alone, literally cents, associated with that. I think the hobbyist forcing function, with all this technology, like you see these things and you think, okay, they have a certain degree of value. The ability to fly one of these things is you can buy, you know, 3D flight simulators that enable you to get the skill basically to fly one of these things. Um, but yes, it is very different. The perception of a plane that's flying. I, Ironically, that was historically how cameras in the air were done with regards to the military. Now it's cameras in the air with bombs attached, be it the cartel or the US or Ukrainians. So it is all very interesting how little elements of technology can become monetized for much less, and still have an interest both in the hobbyist and the military. Um,
Let's go back to artificial life. This is something you've been pursuing for a couple of decades, if not longer.
28
Um,
years.
but the neural network and the large language models, I mean, they're just now, like in the last 4 or 5 years, coming to fruition to where they're interesting to people who didn't have a pre-existing interest. What has that done to the artificial life program?
Well, it's interesting because there's actually an annual conference that is held with regards to artificial life. It's very curious because my friend and co-videocaster Dr. Umi Khan went to ones just as they were reopening after COVID. The artificial life conference through COVID did virtual conferences. So there were a whole bunch of people that kind of dropped off. This is the interesting about knowing the history of it, because we have people who are in their third or fourth postdoc that don't have a knowledge of the things that I have a knowledge of intimately. A bunch of different technologies that came out in the origin. So what happened was the artificial life community dropped off in some regard through COVID. I thought it was going to die through COVID. I couldn't see any way that anyone, speaking of shamans, I couldn't see the way that anyone who had the history that I had in this thing would maintain it for any length of time. So the Artificial Life Conference now is about 200, 300 people, which it was when I was in 2012 going to a conference then. But what has happened is that group has been replaced by ML researchers, a small fraction of hobbyists still at the top or at the bottom, depending on which way you want to look at it, top up or bottom down. But then it's been replaced by a bunch of ML folk, and also people that understand how artificial life has impacted ML and vice versa. So it's a fascinating community that it still remains kind of token stock, maybe 200 people. I mean, nominally I should be going to these conferences as well. However, I just present myself virtually now at these conferences, which is particularly fascinating because I have to record it with a slightly hushed tone, as my daughters are sleeping in the next room when I actually, record videos for these conferences. But yes, I think it's an interesting community which has evolved, not devolved through COVID, which I'm ultimately happy about. It just means that I speak a completely different language to most contemporary researchers in the field.
Well, I think most people are going to hear the term artificial life and they're going to have some very science fiction imagery come to mind. But this is something that is an ongoing project and has been for decades. What is artificial life for somebody with nothing beyond a sci-fi reference for that term?
Well, it is a sci-fi reference, as life as it
Hmm.
could be. So it basically is a combination of biology, computer science, philosophy, um, a wide variety of big academic names, associated people. I always joke that artificial life doesn't have founding fathers; it has deadbeat dads. Academics that have come to it had some impact, like Richard Dawkins, for example, and then no longer want to have anything to do with it. So there's this whole metaphor associated with what artificial life is. Contemporarily, it's people that are still that want to look for different models, basically, and don't go for. Although now they go for traditional neural networks, but historically, I didn't go for traditional neural networks. I was far more interested in layering simulations, um, social simulations, reactive simulations associated with fear and desire. Um, Cynthia Brazil robotics models that have sex, social, hunger, and sleep. These are basic drivers within my simulation as well, even though she does it with robots. So it's a series of different things that come together. Ultimately, in this country, it is the Terminator. Um, in Japan, it's the Ghost in the Shell. So culturally, different groups have different views with regards to what artificial life is specifically. But what I maintain is ability to get it running on the latest Mac operating system, which is a trial in and of itself, basically, and Windows and occasionally Linux if people get involved and want to do that.
So, what has the addition of the machine learning crowd done to the artificial life community?
I think they're very respectful of the community, which is something that I find really very striking. My experience has been that it's not, hence the deadbeat dads analogy. It's not always the most welcoming community. It's a very curious community for people historically that were involved. The ML community, I don't know how good the interface is. I'm being interviewed on a Japanese company called, what do they call? Labs, Cross Labs, which is a Japanese private enterprise associated with bringing artificial life and AI research together. A fascinating group based out of Tokyo. They've been able to pick up a group of different artificial life academics, um, but have never reached out to the hobbyist community. So I represent the capital H hobbyist, fundamentally, Darwin's pigeon fanciers. And my view is that it's going to be very interesting in terms of renegotiating. I have academic papers that no one reads. Um,
That's a meaty comment. It's hard to take in at a glance.
it is. But
Oh,
no, that's what I feel associated with my particular role with regards to this thing.
so Ben Rubber posted wrote a song on my channel with the line, quote, "When will the oil in our brain be incompatible with long-term civilization?" Question mark, close quote. Would be funny to create life that can thrive off eutrophication. What does that word mean to you, Tom?
I'm going to plug my YouTube channel. My view is that Bitcoin is the most notable version of artificial life that exists currently, which might be eutrophication. Anyway, so maybe Ben can let us know in the chat, or Benny, depending on how you read his name. But yet, the folks that think Bitcoin is artificial life are fascinating because they're another group who don't have any movement in the academic circles. But harmful algal blooms have become a typical lowland water bodies downstream from big AG. True, true. You can simulate harmful algal blooms quite comfortably. I have a background in doing that too. Anyway,
So eutrophication, to me, you as in good, troph is movement, the rest just is a process. So the process of moving toward the good, is that what that is?
I would assume so.
Eutrophication? Okay.
People that are in Bitcoin also claim that to be the case. Many who aren't in Bitcoin claim it's the antithesis of that.
All right, here we go. Here's our definition. Eutrophication is the process by which a body of water becomes enriched with nutrients, particularly phosphates and nitrates, leading to excessive growth of algae and aquatic plants. So, not necessarily good. All right.
Well, just a byproduct. It's a
Oh,
byproduct of the process, basically.
thanks to Perplexity AI for that definition.
Very good. Going full circle. Going full circle.
So Ghost in the Shell. I have loved that franchise since I saw the original movie in, I forget exactly what year it came out. I think it was after Akira, so in the early 90s, early to mid 90s.
Yeah,
Can't
I
remember.
was I was thinking it was close to 89, but you might be right in that. It was in that period of time where I saw it too.
But the shell in that title, Ghost in the Shell, could easily be translated as Ghost in the Machine. And in that, it started off as a manga by Masamune Shiro, is the original writer artist. And the ghost basically is the human spirit, which is the human cognition or the human consciousness, which can be transferred into a cyber brain. But there has to be an original consciousness. Like there are robots in this universe, but they're not like the agents in this team. This paramilitary team that Major Kusanagi is the head of. And to me, that seems, as somebody who has got into all of this in the 90s through the door of philosophy of mind. A major question of philosophy of mind is consciousness multiply realizable, or is it something that is unique to biological matter, as somebody like John Searle would insist? And my intuition has always been that no, it is multiply realizable, that you can have machine consciousness which is not ported over from a human brain, that is not necessarily an emulation of a human brain. There's probably different organizations in different ways to implement consciousness. So the fact that Masamune Shiro's whole franchise references the ghost in the machine or the ghost in the shell is really curious to me. Like it's counterintuitive to me that should be so important.
I think certainly what the Japanese believe with regards to artificial life is very different than what it's idiomatic. We can't actually understand it fundamentally, and I think what you've returned to is basically a continuing problem that I have associated with realizing that cultural integrity can actually define something which is idiomatic fundamentally. So we, with our Western eyes, look at that and assume it that way. The Japanese have a different perspective with regards to consciousness, everything that exists with regards to the metaphor. So it's interesting to think that when we come to these things, we have our own particular proclivities that we need to acknowledge when we enter the space. And the notion of just robotics and interactive robotics is in a very different place in Japanese culture than it is here. Certainly, Imikan researches with large head robots that they project faces onto that interact with people with dementia in order to basically not only study the process of dementia, but actually study how to improve dementia with these particular robots. So I think what we find is cultures develop their own science fiction. They also develop their own science fact as well, fundamentally. So we need to be very mindful that, and this goes back to the Iranian Terminators as well, that a culture will embody some aspect of the ghost in the shell, which may not necessarily be what we immediately think of, but is culturally very idiomatic and sensitive. And I think that's the nature, basically, as you say, of the franchise, this particular vision.
You've mentioned, I don't remember if the phrase you used was cultural cohesion or cultural integrity, but if an English-speaking white man says he places any value on the integrity of his culture, he is a racist and a Nazi and a contemptible figure. But the Japanese they make no apology for the fact that they do value their cultural integrity and that they will go to great lengths to maintain it. And in the face of declining birth rates and their unwillingness to make up the loss of new Japanese people with immigrants, they are anxious to move the whole robotic paradigm forward as quickly as possible and culturally very receptive to it.
Certainly.
Yeah, and it's an interesting case study because they are part of the modern world, they are part of the international community, and yet all of the shaming and particularly given the history of World War II, culturally the Japanese have a lot to be ashamed of. They are not having it. They will not be shamed into accepting unlimited immigration and cultural dilution. And here you are, English, Australian, American person. What's your perspective on that?
Why don't we feel ashamed associated with the Second World War? I mean, my view is that there's nothing. Um, I mean, obviously, there's a history, the Saving Private Ryan,
Mm-hmm.
which represents a very curious history of the Second World War. But I think the shame associated, which is ultimately the German case as well, the shame associated with the Second World War cannot be underestimated with regards to people in the West too. If you take a full view of this, um, there's a lot that the people in the West have done, which should be culturally shamed as well. It is interesting that you can't have a swastika on anything that's in Germany and available for sale. So the whole nature of shame, whereas American flags just abound. They're just
Mm-hmm. Well, we,
everywhere.
we won the war. So.
Well, the question is really, did we win the war from any particular perspective? We certainly brought in a whole bunch of German intelligence to make
Mhm.
NASA. We basically took a bunch of people who were financiers, made them Americans, and made them culturally appropriate. I think actually the notion of who actually won the war is very curious because basically both Japan and Germany, or at least West Germany, built up their infrastructure, built up their wealth, did a variety of things having come out of the Second World War. I think, depending on how you look at it, who won the war is a very interesting. I mean, did the Soviet Union win the war? Who won the war? Or did everyone who weren't German and Japanese win the war? Well, I know plenty of people, particularly on mainland Europe, that wouldn't feel that way at all. That the whole thing with regards to who won the war is a very curious question in the present day and worthy of some merit of discussion, I think.
Well, I think who won the war and who prospered after the war are different questions.
Certainly.
But Japan and Germany are a fascinating contrast in that both of them were utterly destroyed in terms of their infrastructure, and both of them got rebuilt with basically American supervision. The U.S. wrote the Japanese Constitution, and then provided lots of guidance and material support. And both countries prospered in the decades after World War II, but Germany is the embodiment of self-flagellation in terms of being sorry and wanting to distance themselves from all associations of their past misdeeds. And Japan is just not having it. They will not be shamed. And in terms of how the Japanese military treated the civilian populations of the countries that they invaded, uh, they have as much reason, if not the most reason, to be ashamed of anybody, and yet they just won't. In fact, to this day, they like we talk in geopolitics about the three-way relationship between the United States, South Korea, and Japan, but there is no three-way relationship because the Japanese and the South Koreans won't talk to each other. They hate each other, at least the older generations do, and it is only through the moderating influence of the United States that they can have any sort of relationship at all. I lived in Japan in the 90s, and I had to go over to Seoul a couple times just to renew my Japanese tourist visa while I was looking for a job that would sponsor me so I could stay long term. And one time I flew to Seoul, and I was this hippie dude. I had long hair and I was wearing a bandana, like to hold my hair out of my head. Because when I worked as an English teacher, I wore a suit and I slicked my hair back, and it's kind of a Gordon Gekko kind of look to it. But when I wasn't at work, it was just free flowing. So I would keep it out of my face with a bandana. And so here I am, this hippie dude waiting in line, at customs at the Seoul airport. And behind me is this long, or actually, I'm in the middle of this long line of Japanese businessmen who have flown to Korea for the day to play golf. And being Japanese, they're very fastidious. Their golf bags, every club in the golf bag is individually wrapped in plastic. And the South Korean customs agents were taking a razor blade and making the Japanese golfers take every individual club out of their golf bags. They would slit open the plastic and slowly inspect each golf club just to inconvenience these Japanese businessmen. And there was a customs agent who's just walking along, the line, and he looks at me and he points at his head. He says, "What's this?" And I said, "Oh, it keeps the hair out of my eyes." And he laughed. He pulled me out of the line. He said, "You can go. You know, the whole point here is to just take our petty revenge on the Japanese any way we can at every opportunity, and you don't have to sit around and watch it." Was the position. So, I mean, this is just a shaggy dog story in the service of the Japanese military during World War II created enduring hatred among the rest of Asia. And it is like, the people who did it are dead, but culturally it is deserved. And culturally, Japanese to this day will not apologize for it. The South Koreans are always trying to get the new Japanese prime minister, when they come into office, to issue some public apology. And it's like pulling teeth. They simply will not. And this goes back to the cultural cohesion. They will not be shamed for being Japanese. And I know that a lot of people on the American right look to that attitude with admiration. And I look at it with sympathy, if not admiration.
So the left and the right mean something distinctly different in this country, to certainly the way I was raised. I mean, my father was academically was a Marxist for a period of time. Ironically, that his friends in the US who are Marxist occasionally appear on Fox News now when they need a card-carrying liberal to actually humiliate. A fellow by the name of Bertel Allman, who's now in his 80s, I think, was interviewed on Fox News by Hannity, perhaps just Hannity, because he'd given Hannity a low grade when he had done at probably NYU a degree with Bertel Allman. So I'm always interested, particularly from your perspective as a kind of, relatively learned person in this field. Do you get, sorry, we've got a garage door here that's opening.
Okay.
What does left and right actually mean to you currently? Do you point to political parties, or what do you do to engage those dynamics?
In terms of political philosophy, you would think the left would be opposed to a capitalist society, but there is no representation of that form of the left in the U.S.
Certainly.
government. Outside of Bernie Sanders, who is just the most token of socialists. So yeah, because both the Republican and Democratic parties serve the same core group of economic interests, they have to define themselves culturally. And so, the left is the culture of Silicon Valley. It is the culture of academia. It is increasingly the culture of government. And the right, to the extent that anybody, outside of the Donald Trump phenomenon or before the Donald Trump phenomenon, the cultural right was largely adrift and disorganized and fragmented, and pretty thoroughly defeated in the court of public opinion.
Certainly.
And Trump, who is, in terms of ideology, an utterly vacuous figure, stands for nothing.
Except he's the other. I mean, in
exactly,
being
he is the
figure, he's
representative
the other.
of this
Yes.
fragmented right, this fragmented
Yes.
cultural right. But yeah, if you are going to be, academic and precise in terms of defining what the left and right is, the left is irrelevant. There is no left in the United States.
Yes,
It
certainly
is
that's
all- it
my
is all
father and
centered
Bertel
around-
Allman's view. So,
Yeah.
KMO, I'm going to have to cut this short, unfortunately. I have a day planned with my daughters. So thank you
Not
very
that
much for...
Not that short. It's 53 minutes and 55 seconds that we've been
Very
going,
good.
so.
Very good. Will this end up on YouTube, or is this just a live stream that...
It's on YouTube now. Depending on the audio quality, I might take it down and then repost just an audio version that I've adjusted. We'll see.
Okay, very cool.
But it will be available, and I'll send you a link.
Very cool. And yes, I might have to wait to put our discussion online, but you'll see very quickly why that reason is. Anyway,
Okay.
I'll talk to you soon, my friend.
Tom Barbalet, thank you.
It's been a pleasure as always.